Caleb Blackwood rode into the town of Dust Creek with a silence that clung to him like the alkali dust on his coat. The town was a raw wound on the face of the plains, a place of hard men and harder bargains, and he had come for the hardest bargain of all. His ranch, miles from this festering sore of civilization, was a hollow thing, an echo chamber for his grief. His daughter, Rose, was a ghost within its walls, a small, 6-year-old wisp of a girl with tangled hair and eyes that held the same vacant grey as the winter sky. He was a widower, a man whose heart had been buried alongside his wife, Sarah, 2 years prior, leaving a cold, packed earth where feeling used to be. He needed a housekeeper, a woman's hands to tend to the chores he had no patience for and the child he no longer knew how to reach. He dismounted not at the general store, but before the gaudy red facade of the saloon, a place where contracts of servitude were bought and sold like cattle. Inside, the air was thick with cheap whiskey and despair. He saw her in a corner, set apart from the boisterous, painted women. She was Chinese, slight of build, with eyes that were not empty but defiant, holding a deep, still water of resilience. The saloon owner, a fleshy man named Finch, sneered as he gestured toward her. "This one's quiet." "Works hard," the implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken and ugly. Caleb's gaze met hers for a fleeting second. He saw no plea, only a profound and weary strength. He threw a heavy pouch of coin on the bar. The sound was a final, dead thud. It was a transaction of desperation, devoid of humanity. He had not bought a wife, or even a woman. He had purchased a function, a set of hands. As they rode out of town, the setting sun bleeding across the horizon, he gave her the only instructions he could muster. Cook. Clean. Care for the child. She nodded once, her back straight against the jolting of the horse. The vast, empty landscape stretched before them, a perfect mirror for the desolate territory of his soul. The ranch house was a testament to a life paused mid-breath. It was scrubbed clean, for Caleb was a man of order, but it was a sterile, lifeless cleanliness. It smelled of wood smoke, dust, and the lingering scent of old sorrow. The woman, who he learned was called Mai, stepped across the threshold and the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. She began her work immediately, moving with a silent, fluid grace that was almost unnerving. She did not ask for instruction, her observant eyes taking in the state of the home in a single, sweeping glance. The floors were scrubbed until the pine board seemed to sigh with relief, releasing a faint, clean scent. She found Sarah's old sewing basket, the thread dry and brittle, and began mending the sun-bleached curtains with careful, precise stitches, her needle a tiny silver fish swimming through worn fabric. Soon, the suffocating silence of the house was punctuated by new sounds, the soft thump of a butter churn, the rhythmic scrape of a knife against a cutting board, the whisper of a broom across the floor. Most profoundly, a new scent began to permeate the air, chasing the ghosts from the corners. It was the smell of baking bread, a warm, yeasty aroma of life and sustenance that filled the hollow spaces in the house and in Caleb's chest, spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. He watched her from a distance, from the barn doorway or the edge of the porch, a perpetual knot of suspicion tightening his gut. He was a man accustomed to the harsh transactions of the world. He expected demands, complaints, a chipping away at his solitude. He received only a quiet, relentless competence. He noticed the small things, the subtle shifts in his world. A wildflower, a stubborn fleck of purple against the brown earth, appeared one morning in a tin cup on the kitchen windowsill. He saw her one afternoon, gently, patiently untangling Rose's matted hair, her touch so tender it made an ache bloom deep inside him. The house was changing, and he felt a terrifying, unfamiliar stirring, like the first crack of a thaw in a frozen river. Rose, a child who had learned silence from the very walls of her home, was the first to surrender. She began to follow Mai, a small, solemn shadow trailing the quiet drift of her skirts. At first, she kept her distance, her thumb tucked firmly in her mouth, her eyes wide and watchful. But Mai never pushed, never forced an interaction. She simply existed, a calm and steady presence in the child's turbulent, lonely world. One afternoon, as Mai stood at the rough-hewn kitchen table, her hands pale with flour as she kneaded a mound of dough, Rose crept closer. The child reached out a hesitant, grimy finger and touched the back of Mai's hand, leaving a perfect, miniature print in the white dust. Caleb, mending a harness by the fire, saw my freeze for a fraction of a second. He expected her to flinch, to pull away. Instead, she turned her head slowly and gave the child a smile. It wasn't a wide, bright thing, but a small, sad, and beautiful curve of her lips that seemed to hold all the sorrows of the world, and yet offered a sliver of warmth. A week later, the true breakthrough came. Rose approached me, clutching a piece of scrap paper. On it was a child's drawing, 3 stick figures under a lopsided sun. One was tall and broad, clearly her father. One was tiny, with a triangle for a dress. The third, in the middle, had long, straight lines of black hair. Rose pointed a trembling finger at this third figure and her voice, rusty from disuse, whispered a single, devastating word. "Mama." A shadow of immense pain crossed Mai's face, but she knelt down, her eyes level with the child's. She gently shook her head, a gesture of profound empathy. Caleb stood in the doorway of the barn, a silent witness to the exchange, and felt the packed earth of his heart crack open, just a little. That night, as he tucked Rose into her small bed, his daughter looked up at him, her gaze unnervingly direct. "Papa," she asked, her voice clear as a bell in the quiet room, "why is your face always winter?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless and exposed. The sky began to curdle in late autumn, the pale blue bruising to a sullen, violent purple. A blizzard, born in the unforgiving northern mountains, swept down across the plains with the fury of a vengeful god. It was a solid wall of white, a monster of wind and ice that howled and scraped against the small, vulnerable house, trying to claw its way inside. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, their isolation now absolute and terrifying. The wind moaned through the chinks in the logs, a mournful, constant cry that frayed the nerves. The landscape, once a symbol of Caleb's emotional emptiness, was now a tangible threat, a churning sea of white that could swallow a man whole. It was in this suffocating crucible that Rose began to cough, a dry, rattling sound that grew wetter and more desperate with each passing hour. A fever took hold, blooming like a malevolent flower on her pale cheeks. She grew listless, her small body burning with an unnatural heat. The crisis stripped away the fragile routines they had built, tearing down the walls of silence and forcing them into a raw, desperate state of mutual dependency. Caleb was undone. His stoicism, the armor he had worn for 2 years, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He saw not this new sickness, but the old one, the fever that had stolen Sarah from him, leaving him helpless and raging at a silent heaven. He knew the town, and its doctor was a 2-day ride in the best of weather. In this blinding, shrieking storm, it was a fool's errand, a ride into a white grave. He was trapped, cornered by the same cruel fate, and the familiar, cold tendrils of despair began to wrap around his heart, squeezing the very life from him. He was losing his daughter, and he was utterly, completely powerless to stop it. Rose's fever climbed, a relentless tide of heat that pulled her further away from them. In her delirium, she cried out, her small voice thin and reedy against the roaring of the wind. She called for her mother, her words twisting in Caleb's gut like a knife. He sat by her bedside, a useless monument of a man carved from grief and fear. His large, capable hands, so adept at mending fences and calming spooked horses, were clumsy and worthless in the face of this invisible enemy. He could only watch, his soul eroding with every ragged breath his daughter took. It was Mai who moved into the space his paralysis had created. She took command not with words, but with a quiet, fierce determination. She ventured into the storm-lashed pantry and returned with dried herbs Caleb didn't recognize, their scent sharp and bitter as she brewed them over the fire. Her knowledge of these old remedies was a mystery, a part of the world she came from that he had never bothered to consider. She bathed Rose's forehead with cloths dipped in snow she'd gathered from the porch, the water shockingly cold, a small battle against the fire consuming the child. The house grew colder as the hours wore on. The blizzard was relentless, siphoning the warmth through the very logs of the walls. The firewood pile dwindled at an alarming rate. Exhaustion began to settle on Caleb, a heavy, bone-deep weariness that was part fatigue, part despair. He slumped in a chair by the fire, his own body beginning to tremble with a violent chill. The cold was seeping into him, and with it, the ghost of his past failure. He saw Sarah's face in the flickering firelight, her eyes pleading with him to do something, anything. He had failed her then, and he was failing Rose now. He felt his resolve crumbling, the last of his strength draining away into the cold, hard floor. He was not just a father watching his child sicken, he was a man about to lose the only anchor he had left in the world, and he was sinking fast. The fire in the hearth dwindled to a bed of sullen, angry embers, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping fingers on the walls. It threw just enough light to illuminate the shallow, labored rise and fall of Rose's chest. Caleb sat hunched in his chair, shivering so violently his teeth chattered, a sound like rattling stones in the oppressive quiet. He was lost in a fog of cold and grief, his face as pale and drawn as a death mask. Mai looked at him, her gaze moving from the fragile child in the bed to the broken man in the chair. In her eyes, there was no pity, no softness. There was a hard, practical light, an expression forged in the crucible of a life that had demanded survival above all else. She saw not just a father about to lose his child, but a vital source of warmth and life that was failing when it was needed most. She moved with purpose, pulling the thickest, heaviest quilt from the chest at the foot of the bed, a patchwork of faded colors that held the last real warmth in the room. She walked to him and stood before him, blocking the dying light of the fire. She looked directly into his glazed, unfocused eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was low, but it cut through the howling wind and his own internal storm with the clean, sharp edge of tempered steel. "You're coming to bed with me tonight," she said. It was not an invitation, not a proposition whispered in the dark. It was a command, an order for survival issued by a general in a desperate battle. Her chin lifted as she gestured with her head toward the narrow bed where Rose lay. "She needs your warmth. I need you to live. We will get through this night together." A flicker of something that was not mirth but a sharp, fierce defiance touched her lips as the Chinese prostitute he had bought grinned. It was the baring of teeth against the storm, against death, against the cruel indifference of the world. It was the grin of a fighter who refused to lose. Caleb, too weak and too broken to argue, could only stare at her for a moment before he stumbled to his feet and obeyed. They lay huddled together under the weight of the quilt, a strange trinity of suffering and hope. Rose's small, feverish body was a burning ember between them, a fragile source of heat against the invasive, bone-deep cold of the cabin. The last of Caleb's defenses, the stone walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart, crumbled into dust. The proximity, the shared, desperate fight for his daughter's life, stripped him bare. In the profound darkness, with the wind singing its mournful dirge outside, the words he had locked away for 2 years finally broke free. He spoke of Sarah, his voice a raw, cracked whisper. He told Mai of the swift, merciless fever that had taken her, of the guilt that had festered in him ever since, a poison in his blood. He spoke of his own inadequacy, of the crushing helplessness he felt both then and now. He confessed the reason for the house's emptiness, for the winter in his face. He had been afraid that to let any new warmth in would be a betrayal of the love he had lost. He poured out his grief and his shame into the quiet space between them, and Mai listened. Her silence was not empty, it was a vessel, strong enough to hold the full, terrible weight of his pain without breaking. When his ragged voice finally fell silent, she waited a long moment, the only sound the frantic beating of his heart. Then, she spoke, her own voice barely a whisper, a rustle of dry leaves in the dark. She told him of a village nestled in green hills by a wide, slow river, of a family's laughter lost to famine and fire. She spoke of a treacherous journey across a cold, grey sea, chasing promises of a better life that had turned to ash in the grimy backrooms and cruel transactions of a new, hard land. They were 2 shipwrecks, 2 broken souls from opposite ends of the earth, who had washed up on the same desolate shore, finding in the wreckage a single, shared splinter of warmth to cling to in a world of ice. When the world outside the cabin windows finally reappeared, it was washed clean, draped in a blinding, pristine blanket of white. The blizzard had broken, leaving a profound and ringing silence in its wake. Inside, the fever had also broken. Rose was awake, her eyes clear and her skin cool to the touch. She was weak, a pale little doll, but she was alive. As the snow melted under a strengthening sun, the first tentative hints of spring began to touch the land, a promise of renewal. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, the old silence replaced by something softer, more comfortable. Then, one afternoon, the peace was shattered by the rumble of a wagon and the jangle of harnesses. It was Finch, the saloon owner from Dust Creek, his fleshy face set in a sneer of ownership. He had 2 grim-faced, armed men with him. He spat a wad of tobacco juice near the porch steps. "Contract's up, Blackwood," he called out, his voice oily with contempt. "Come to collect my property," he leered at Mai, who had come to stand in the doorway, her face a calm, unreadable mask. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, moving to stand slightly in front of her. The rifle in his hands was held loosely, almost casually, but his posture was rigid. He was not the same hollowed-out man who had ridden into Dust Creek months ago. The winter had tempered him, reforged him. Finch chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Step aside, Blackwood. She's just a hired hand, and her time is paid for." Caleb's voice, when he spoke, was as quiet as the frost-laden air, but it carried the chilling weight of the blizzard they had survived. "She is not for sale," he said, his eyes locking with Finch's. "This is her home." Finch's amusement curdled into anger. He took a step forward. "I own her." In that moment, Caleb raised the rifle, the movement fluid and certain. "And she is my wife." The declaration hung in the air, as solid and real as a wall of stone, a shield forged in the desperate heat of the crucible. It was a lie, but it was the truest thing he had ever said. Finch stared into the unyielding ice of Caleb's eyes, saw the promise of swift and final violence there, and for the first time, he faltered. He muttered a curse, backed away, and rumbled off down the trail, leaving only silence and the weight of that powerful, protective word behind. The word wife settled over the ranch, a soft, heavy blanket of meaning. It had been a lie, a desperate gambit spoken to protect, but as the days passed, it began to feel more real than the cold, transactional truth of their arrangement. The silence that had once been a chasm of distance between Caleb and Mai was now a comfortable, shared space, filled with unspoken understanding. The change in Caleb was profound. He began to speak, not in long monologues, but in small, meaningful fragments. He would ask Mai about the strange, fragrant herbs she was now cultivating in a small patch of earth behind the house. He would listen, truly listen, as she made a quiet observation about the coming rain or the habits of a hawk circling overhead. He started to see the world through her eyes, a world rich with detail and quiet wisdom he had been blind to in his grief. One afternoon, he sat on the porch steps, whittling a piece of scrap pine. Under his patient knife, the wood slowly transformed into the shape of a small, graceful bird. He sanded it smooth and gave it to Rose, who cradled it in her hands as if it were the most precious treasure on earth. As he watched his daughter's joy, he caught Mai's eye from across the porch, and a genuine smile, the first she had ever seen from him, touched his lips. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it transformed his harsh features, revealing a warmth he had kept buried for years. Later that evening, after Rose was asleep, he opened the small, carved wooden box where he kept Sarah's few possessions. He bypassed the delicate locket and the pearl earrings, his fingers closing around a simple, unadorned silver band. It was her first ring, the one he'd given her when they had nothing but each other. He walked outside, where Mai was tending to her small garden in the twilight. He didn't kneel or offer any flowery words. He simply stood before her and held out the ring in his calloused palm, the silver gleaming in the fading light. "To make it true," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She looked from the ring to his face, a face no longer carved from winter stone, and slowly, she placed her hand in his, accepting the promise he offered. The seasons turned, painting the plains in the vibrant greens of spring, the sun-baked gold of summer, and the russet hues of autumn. The small house on the prairie was no longer a hollow shell, a monument to loss. It was a home, breathing with life. The air was now constantly filled with the scent of Mai's cooking, the sound of Rose's bright, carefree laughter, and the deep, quiet comfort of 3 lives woven inextricably together. The single wildflower in the tin cup had been joined by a row of its brethren, a cheerful line of purple and yellow blooms that greeted visitors from the porch rail. Caleb, his face softened by smiles he no longer held back, taught Rose how to ride a small, steady pony, his large hand resting reassuringly on hers. His patience was a deep, calm well. In turn, Mai taught the child characters from her own language, a world away from the dusty plains of their home. She would draw the intricate symbols in the dirt with a stick, her voice a soft murmur as she explained their meanings, a bridge between two worlds. They were a strange and beautiful family, a tapestry woven from threads of profound sorrow, fierce resilience, and a love that had grown slowly, quietly, in the harshest of soils. One evening, they stood together on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, setting the sky ablaze with streaks of orange and pink. Caleb's arm rested naturally, possessively, around Mai's shoulders. Rose was inside, sleeping soundly in the bed they had once huddled in for survival. He looked out at the vast, peaceful expanse of land, the same land that had once seemed so empty and menacing. He no longer saw it as a reflection of his own desolation, but as a boundless promise of their shared future. He had ridden into Dust Creek to purchase a housekeeper, a cold transaction of coin and desperation meant to patch the holes in his broken life. What he had received, by some grace he knew he didn't deserve, was a woman who had walked into the frozen landscape of his soul and patiently, quietly, taught it how to thaw. She had shown him that the most profound commitments are not sealed with vows spoken before a crowd, but are built in the silent, sacred spaces where one broken heart learns, finally, to beat in time with another. His life had been bought and paid for, too, not with the silver in his pocket, but with her unwavering, world-changing grace.